Sweaty palms hovered over the cracked keyboard. Maeve hit send, the click deafening in the dead quiet apartment. She just needed a fake passport and a flight out, a simple transaction with a black market ghoster. 10 minutes later, the screen glowed with a single new message. No price quote. No meeting location. Just 2 words from an address that made the bottom drop out of her stomach. I'm coming. She hadn't emailed the fixer. She'd emailed the apex predator of the city. The underside of the laptop was hot enough to burn her thighs, a dull, insistent heat that grounded her in the miserable reality of the moment. It was 2:14 a.m. The digital clock on the stove blinked a neon green 12 o'clock, as it had since she moved in 3 weeks ago, a mocking reminder of time standing still. The apartment smelled of boiled cabbage from the unit down the hall, layered beneath the sharp, chemical tang of cheap lemon bleach she had used to scrub the linoleum. Maeve rubbed the heels of her hands into her eyes until bursts of static color flared in the darkness behind her eyelids. Her spine ached. A deep, bruised throb radiated from her left rib cage, a parting gift from Tommy before she'd slipped out the back door of their shared townhouse with nothing but a canvas duffel bag and a stolen ledger. She stared at the screen. The brightness was turned all the way down, casting a sickly, pale blue wash over her exhausted face. The cursor blinked in the empty recipient field of a secure email client. She needed to disappear. Not just to another state, but entirely. Tommy wasn't just a bad ex-boyfriend with a heavy hand. He was a mid-level earner for the North Side crew, a man whose ego was far more fragile and dangerous than his fists. When he realized the ledger, the one detailing a year's worth of skimmed profits he'd been hiding from his own bosses, was gone, he wouldn't just call the police. He'd call men who buried people in the foundations of new high-rises. Maeve forced her hands to stop shaking. She closed her eyes and visualized the scraps of information she'd gleaned over 2 years of playing the silent, compliant girlfriend. Tommy used a fixer for his off-the-books problems. A ghoster. A man who could turn a living, breathing person into a whisper and a one-way ticket to Oaxaca. Russo. That was the name. Richard Russo. She opened her eyes, ignoring the sting of exhaustion, and typed out the address she had seen over Tommy's shoulder 6 months ago. r.russo@omen-secure.net. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy. The O key stuck slightly. She hammered it down, typing the rest of the address. She didn't write a subject line. In the body, she typed the code phrase she remembered Tommy using when he needed immediate extraction for a runner. Need a clean slate. Standard fee plus 20% for a rush job. Tonight, she didn't proofread it. If she stopped to read the desperate plea, she would lose her nerve entirely and just wait for Tommy to kick the door in. She slammed the enter key. The screen showed a small, spinning wheel. It turned once, twice, and then a tiny green check mark appeared. Message sent. Maeve exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that sounded entirely too loud in the cramped kitchen. She pushed the laptop onto the scarred Formica table and stood up. The linoleum peeled at the corners, sticky beneath her bare feet. She walked to the window, pulling the moth-eaten curtain back a fraction of an inch. Outside, the city was a smear of sodium-orange streetlights and slick, rain-blackened asphalt. A siren wailed in the distance, a lonely, rising pitch that faded into the hum of traffic from the interstate. The glass was cold against her forehead. 10 minutes. She told herself she would wait 10 minutes for a reply before she grabbed her bag and took her chances at the Greyhound station. The station was suicide. It was crawling with lookouts, but staying here felt like lying down in a coffin and waiting for someone to nail the lid shut. She walked to the tiny kitchen sink, turned the faucet, and let the water run, until the rusty brown tint cleared. She cupped her hands and drank. The water tasted metallic, like old pennies. Ping. The sound was sharp, synthesized, and agonizingly loud. Maeve choked, water spilling down her chin, soaking the collar of her oversized grey t-shirt. She spun around, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. The laptop screen had gone to sleep. She approached it slowly, as if it were a live explosive. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her sore ribs. Fixers didn't reply in 10 minutes. Fixers made you wait. Fixers made you sweat to drive up the price. She tapped the trackpad. The screen flared to life. An unread message sat in her inbox. She swallowed hard, the click in her throat audible. She clicked open the message. There was no greeting, no encrypted payment link, no list of instructions regarding drop sites or burner phones. There were only 2 words, typed in stark, plain text. "I'm coming." Maeve frowned, her eyebrows drawing together. A cold dread began to uncoil in her stomach. That wasn't right. The tone was completely wrong. It was too immediate, too personal. Her eyes darted to the top of the screen, to the sent folder. She clicked it. She looked at the address she had typed. r.rossi@omen-secure.net. The breath vanished from her lungs. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thick to breathe. Rossi. Not Russo. Roman Rossi. She hadn't emailed the mid-level fixer. She had missed a key, a single, stupid vowel, and sent a desperate, coded plea for extraction to the head of the Rossi syndicate, the very cartel Tommy was stealing from. The cartel that was currently hunting for the ledger she had zipped into a duffel bag. "No," Maeve whispered, her voice cracking. "No, no, no." She slammed the laptop shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Roman Rossi didn't arrange passports. He arranged funerals. He was a man who existed in the peripheral vision of the city's elite, a name whispered in boardrooms and back alleys with equal parts reverence and terror. Tommy had once gotten drunk and talked about Rossi. "The man doesn't have blood in his veins," Tommy had slurred, staring into the bottom of a whiskey glass. "He's got ice water and battery acid. You don't look him in the eye unless you're ready to lose them." And she had just sent him her location, asking for a favor. Or worse, from his perspective, she was a random nobody spamming a highly classified syndicate server with cryptic demands. He had replied, "I'm coming." Why? Why would the boss himself come? The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The secure server. It must have flagged Tommy's name, or her IP address, or the specific phrasing she used. Rossi didn't know he was coming to help a battered girlfriend. He thought he was coming to intercept a rat. She had 10 minutes. Maybe less. Panic is rarely clean. It doesn't sharpen the senses into a state of hypercompetence. It fragments them. Maeve's vision tunneled. The edges of the kitchen blurred into meaningless shapes as she scrambled towards the bedroom. Her foot caught on the edge of the cheap, fraying rug, sending her sprawling hard onto the floorboards. Pain flared in her bruised ribs, sharp and breathless. But she didn't stop. She scrambled up, her breathing jagged, tasting the copper tang of fear in the back of her throat. She reached the bedroom, a glorified closet with a mattress on the floor, and grabbed her canvas duffel bag. Her hands shook so violently she could barely operate the zipper. It caught on a loose nylon thread. She yanked it, tearing the fabric, tearing a nail back to the quick. A sharp curse punched out of her as a bead of blood welled on her thumb, smearing across the heavy green canvas. Passport. Cash. The ledger. She jammed a pair of jeans and a heavy sweater into the bag. She needed shoes. Where were her boots? She found one under the radiator, covered in a fine layer of grey dust. The other was nowhere to be seen. "Think, Maeve, think," she muttered, the sound of her own voice doing nothing to steady her nerves. She dropped to her hands and knees, sweeping her arms under the mattress. Her fingers brushed the cold, hard toe of the leather boot. She dragged it out, shoving her feet into them without bothering with socks. She laced them with frantic, clumsy jerks, breaking one of the leather strings and tying a messy knot with the remnants. She grabbed the duffel bag by the straps, the weight of the thick leather ledger inside bumping solidly against her hip. She moved toward the apartment door. Then she heard it. The heavy metallic groan of the building's ancient elevator. It shrieked in protest, the sound echoing up the hollow shaft before slamming to a halt on her floor. The heavy iron gate rattled open. Maeve froze. Her hand hovered an inch from the deadbolt. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and entirely lacking the smooth, expensive cadence she imagined a mafia boss would possess. These steps were slightly dragging, scuffing against the threadbare carpet of the hallway. Scuff, thud, scuff, thud. She knew that walk. She had listened to it echo down the hallway of the townhouse 100 times, usually a precursor to a shattered plate or a bruised jaw. It wasn't Rossi. It was Tommy. He had found her. Somehow, between the panicked escape and the botched email, he had tracked her to this miserable hole. "Maeve!" His voice slurred through the cheap plywood door. It was low, meant to be coaxing, but laced with a barely concealed, venomous rage. It smelled of stale beer and cheap cologne, a scent that seemed to seep through the very cracks in the wood. "Open the door, baby. I know you're in there." The super at the desk was very cooperative. Maeve backed away, her breath trapped in her chest. She looked frantically around the tiny living space. There was no fire escape. The window was a straight 4-story drop into a concrete alley filled with rusted dumpsters. "Don't do this the hard way, Maeve," Tommy said, his fist rapping sharply against the wood. Bang! 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 The door shivered in its frame. "You took something of mine, something very important. You give it back, and maybe I just break your legs. You make me come in there. I'll take your face off." She dropped the duffel bag. It hit the floor with a heavy, dead thud. She backed into the kitchen, her eyes darting across the counters. Her hand closed around the handle of a heavy ceramic mug, the only heavy object within reach. It was pathetic. It was nothing. "Last chance, bitch," Tommy snarled. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant. Then the door exploded inward. It wasn't a clean breach. The wood splintered violently around the cheap deadbolt, the metal lock plate tearing free and pinging off the far wall. Tommy stumbled through the ruin of the doorway, his momentum carrying him forward. He looked terrible. His shirt was untucked, dark sweat stains pooling under his arms. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils blown wide, a testament to whatever chemical courage he had ingested before coming here. He saw her standing by the kitchen counter, the mug raised, her face pale and terrified. A cruel, ugly smile stretched across his face, revealing a chipped front tooth. "There she is," he breathed, stepping over the splintered wood. Maeve didn't scream. Screaming wasted air. She threw the mug with everything she had. It was a frantic, uncoordinated pitch. The ceramic grazed his shoulder and shattered violently against the plaster wall behind him, raining sharp white shards onto the linoleum. Tommy barely flinched. He lunged. Maeve tried to dart to the side, to slip past him toward the open, ruined doorway, but his hand lashed out, his fingers tangling brutally into the thick mass of her hair. The pain was blinding, a sharp, searing heat that snapped her head back so hard her neck popped. She cried out, a raw, ugly sound, as he yanked her backward, throwing her onto the small, stained sofa. Dust puffed up from the cushions as she hit them. "You stupid, stupid girl," Tommy spat, climbing over her, his knee pinning her bruised ribs. Maeve gasped, the air completely leaving her lungs. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She fought back blindly, completely devoid of technique. She scratched at his face, her fingernails finding purchase on his cheek, drawing 3 parallel lines of bright red blood. She kicked her heavy boot up, catching him awkwardly on the hip. Tommy grunted in pain, his hand letting go of her hair to deliver a sharp, backhanded slap across her face. The impact cracked like a whip. Maeve's head snapped to the side. Her ears rang instantly, a high-pitched whine drowning out the ambient noise of the room. The metallic taste of blood flooded her mouth. She went limp for a fraction of a second, stunned, her vision swimming. "Where is it?" Tommy screamed, spittle hitting her cheek. His hands went to her throat, his thumbs pressing into her windpipe. "Where's the book, Maeve?" She choked, her hands coming up to claw uselessly at his thick wrists. Her lungs burned. The room began to darken at the edges. She could smell the sour, stale alcohol on his breath, the unwashed grime of his skin. This was it. She was going to die on a cheap, dust-filled sofa, killed by a mid-level thug because she stole a book she didn't even understand. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the final, suffocating darkness. But the pressure on her throat suddenly vanished. The weight on her chest lifted so violently that the sofa physically tipped backward a few inches before slamming back down. Maeve gasped, rolling onto her side, coughing violently as air rushed back into her burning lungs. She clutched her throat, tears streaming down her face, her chest heaving. The ringing in her ears slowly faded, replaced by the sound of wet, tearing cartilage and a sickening crunch. She forced her eyes open, blinking through the blur of tears. The scene in her living room had completely changed. Tommy was no longer focused on her. He was pinned against the far wall, his feet hovering 3 inches off the floor. Holding him there by the throat with only one hand was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a different reality. The newcomer didn't look like a street thug. He didn't look angry. He just looked immensely, profoundly tired. He wore a bespoke charcoal wool suit that was impeccably tailored, yet soaked across the shoulders from the rain. Water dripped from the hem of his overcoat, pooling on the cheap linoleum. The air in the room had shifted, the sour smell of Tommy's sweat entirely replaced by the sharp, clean scent of ozone, rain, and an expensive, woodsy cologne. Roman Rossi. He was taller than she had imagined, with a build that spoke of dense, functional muscle beneath the expensive wool. His face was all sharp angles and deep shadows, illuminated by the flickering neon sign from the street outside. Dark hair, slightly graying at the temples, plastered to his forehead by the rain. His eyes, a pale, striking grey, were locked onto Tommy's purple swelling face. "You're making a mess," Roman said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, smooth as glass and completely devoid of inflection. He wasn't yelling. He was stating a fact. Tommy gagged, his hands clawing uselessly at the leather-gloved hand, clamping his windpipe. His legs kicked in the air, boots scraping against the cheap wallpaper. "Rossi," Tommy managed to choke out, his eyes bulging. Recognition and sheer, unadulterated terror morphed his features into something pitiful. You can die," Roman corrected him softly. "That is the only thing you are going to do tonight, Thomas." Roman didn't pull a gun. He didn't monologue. He simply adjusted his grip slightly, his knuckles turning white beneath the black leather of his glove. With a brutal, clinical efficiency that turned Maeve's stomach, Roman slammed Tommy's head backward into the plaster wall. Once, twice. The sound was wet and heavy, like a butcher dropping a side of beef onto a steel table. The plaster cracked, webbing outward in a spiderweb pattern. Tommy's arms fell limp to his sides. His eyes rolled back into his head. Roman let go. Tommy collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, landing in an awkward, broken heap. Blood began to pool slowly beneath his head, staining the grey rug a deep, dark crimson. The room fell dead silent. The only sound was the hiss of the radiator and Maeve's ragged, terrified breathing. Roman stood over the body for a long moment. He pulled a pristine, white cotton handkerchief from his breast pocket and carefully wiped down the leather of his right glove, despite there being no visible blood on it. It was a meticulous, deeply unsettling gesture. He folded the handkerchief, put it back, and slowly turned his head to look at Maeve. Maeve pressed herself into the corner of the sofa, her knees pulled to her chest, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. She had read the books. She had seen the movies. The mob boss was supposed to be a dark knight, a violent but principled man who saved the girl and offered her a coat. Roman Rossi offered nothing but a cold, assessing stare. He looked at her the way a mechanic looks at a complicated broken engine. "You," he said, his voice dropping a register, "are incredibly bad at sending emails." Maeve opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. She swallowed hard, tasting blood, and finally managed a raspy whisper. I meant to email Russo," Roman finished for her, taking a slow step forward. His leather shoes clicked softly on the floorboards, stepping carefully over a puddle of Tommy's blood. "Richard Russo, a mid-level facilitator who handles cheap extractions for domestic disputes and runaway wives." Maeve nodded frantically, her wide eyes locked on his face. Roman sighed. He looked around the dismal apartment, his lip curling slightly in distaste at the peeling wallpaper and the shattered mug on the floor. "Richard Russo," Roman continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the corpse bleeding out on her floor, "was caught skimming from my shipments 3 days ago. He is currently resting in several different pieces at the bottom of the harbor. I commandeered his digital assets to see who he was doing business with." He stopped a few feet from the sofa, towering over her. "Imagine my surprise," Roman said, tilting his head slightly, "when an automated alert pinged my personal phone at 2 in the morning, originating from an IP address tied to one of my own missing runners. Thomas here." He gestured vaguely to the body with his hand, and the email contained a very specific code word for extraction. Maeve's eyes darted to the duffel bag sitting on the floor near his feet. Roman noticed. He looked down at the canvas bag. He casually nudged it with the toe of his expensive shoe. It didn't move easily. It was heavy. "What's in the bag, Maeve?" he asked softly. He knew her name. Of course he did. He owned the server she sent it from. "Clothes," she lied. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, spoken in a voice that shook like a dying leaf. Roman stared at her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. He didn't look angry at the lie. He looked bored by it. He crouched down, his movements smooth and deliberate, the fabric of his suit pulling taut across his broad shoulders. He unzipped the duffel bag. He bypassed the jeans and the heavy sweater. His gloved hand reached straight to the bottom and pulled out the thick, black leather-bound ledger. Maeve closed her eyes, a tear finally escaping and hot tracking down her bruised cheek. It was over. She had traded a rabid dog for a quiet wolf. Roman stood up, holding the ledger in one hand. He flipped it open, scanning the handwritten numbers with a practiced eye. His expression remained entirely unreadable. He closed it with a soft snap and tucked it under his arm. Thomas was an idiot, Roman said quietly, looking down at the corpse. "But he was an idiot who managed to steal a substantial amount of my operational capital that is documented in this book." He looked back at Maeve. She braced herself, waiting for the blow, waiting for him to pull a weapon and silence the only loose end left in the room. Instead, Roman reached into his overcoat and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. He checked the screen, tapped a button, and held it to his ear. "It's done," Roman said into the phone. "Send a cleanup crew to—" He paused, looking at the doorframe to check the apartment number. "Unit 4B. Tell them it's messy. Heavy duty." He hung up and slid the phone back into his coat. He looked at Maeve, shivering on the sofa, her lip busted, blood smeared across her cheek, wearing one boot tied with a broken lace. She looked like a cornered rat, dirty and desperate. "Get up," Roman ordered, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. Maeve flinched. "What?" "Get up," he repeated. "Grab your bag. We are leaving." Where are we going?" she stammered, her voice barely a squeak. "Are you going to kill me?" Roman let out a long, exhausted sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose as if she were a particularly stubborn child keeping him past his bedtime. "If I wanted to kill you, Maeve, I wouldn't have wasted my time breaking Thomas's neck. I would have let him finish the job and simply taken the book from him." He dropped his hand, his grey eyes locking onto hers, pinning her in place. "You have terrible timing, you have terrible aim, and you have terrible judgment in men. But you found the leak in my organization before I did, and you gathered the proof. That makes you useful." He turned his back on her, walking toward the shattered doorway. "You have 30 seconds to get out the door," Roman called over his shoulder, not looking back. "If you are still in this room when my cleanup crew arrives, you will leave in a heavy-duty trash bag. Your choice." He stepped out into the hallway, his silhouette disappearing into the dim light. Maeve stared at the empty doorway. She looked at Tommy's lifeless body, the blood spreading outward, soaking into the grout of the linoleum. She looked at the cheap, dead-end apartment. Her ribs screamed in agony, her face throbbed. She felt sick to her stomach, but her hands moved. She scrambled off the sofa, her legs trembling so badly they almost gave out. She grabbed the straps of her torn duffel bag, hoisted it over her shoulder, and ran out the door, chasing the smell of rain and ozone into the dark. The stairwell smelled of old urine and damp concrete. Maeve took the steps 2 at a time, her breath hitching with every jolt to her ribcage. Ahead of her, Roman moved with an eerie, gliding silence. He didn't run. He didn't even seem to hurry. Yet she had to push her battered body to its absolute limits just to keep his broad, charcoal-clad shoulders in sight. Her right foot, encased in the poorly tied boot, dragged slightly. Her left foot, clad only in a damp grey sock, slapped against the cold concrete. They hit the ground floor just as the wail of police sirens bled into the ambient noise of the city, distant but closing. Roman didn't head for the lobby. He kicked open a heavy steel fire door that spilled out into the back alley. The rain had intensified, shifting from a persistent drizzle to a cold, blinding sheet. It hit Maeve like a physical wall, instantly soaking her thin t-shirt to her skin. The shock of the cold made her gasp, swallowing a mouthful of icy water. An SUV sat idling in the center of the narrow alley. It wasn't a flashy, European sports car. It was a matte black, heavily armored Suburban, squat and ugly, built to withstand small arms fire and physical rams. The exhaust plumed in the cold air, thick and white. As Roman approached, the rear passenger door swung open. The driver, a man built like a cinder block, wearing a suit just as expensive as Roman's, didn't step out. He simply waited. Roman climbed in. He didn't look back to see if she was following. Maeve stood in the rain for 3 agonizing seconds. To her left, the alley opened out onto the street. She could run. She had the canvas bag. She had the cash she'd stolen. But then, she pictured the wet, heavy sound of Tommy's skull hitting the plaster. She looked at the yawning, dark interior of the SUV. She scrambled inside, throwing her bag onto the floorboards before pulling herself up onto the seat. The heavy door pulled shut automatically, with a solid, airtight thunk that instantly cut off the sound of the rain. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, deafening. Maeve shrank against the far door, pulling her knees to her chest. The leather seats were immaculately soft, smelling of cedar, gun oil, and the lingering trace of Roman's ozone cologne. The contrast was nauseating. Her wet clothes stuck to her shivering skin, dripping dirty rainwater and a few smears of Tommy's blood onto the pristine upholstery. "Drive," Roman said. The SUV surged forward, the acceleration smooth and brutally powerful. Maeve was thrown back against the headrest, her teeth clicking together. Roman sat on the opposite side of the bench seat. He had turned on a small, recessed reading light in the ceiling. He was ignoring her completely, his attention focused on the black leather ledger open on his lap. He flipped a page, the dry rustle of paper impossibly loud in the soundproofed cabin. The adrenaline that had propelled Maeve out of the apartment began to recede, leaving behind a cold, agonizing tide of pain. Her face throbbed where Tommy had struck her. The skin felt tight, hot and swollen. Her neck ached from being grabbed by the hair, but it was her ribs that demanded all her attention. Every time the massive vehicle hit a seam in the asphalt, a sharp, white-hot lance of agony shot through her left side, stealing her breath. She wrapped her arms around her midsection, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to stifle a whimper. A small, pathetic sound escaped anyway. Roman didn't look up. "There is a compartment by your left knee. Open it." Maeve flinched at the sound of his voice. She cracked an eye open, her trembling fingers fumbling blindly until they found a sleek metal latch. She pulled it. Inside was a neatly organized first aid kit, a bottle of water, and a small stack of thick, black towels. "Dry off," Roman said, his eyes still scanning a column of Tommy's erratic handwriting. "You smell like a garbage disposal, and my upholstery is imported." It was an incredibly cruel, dismissive thing to say to a woman who had just survived an attempted murder, but the sheer, clinical detachment of it somehow cut through her panic. It wasn't sadistic. It was a statement of fact. To Roman Rossi, she wasn't a damsel. She was a biohazard, leaking onto his custom interior. Maeve grabbed a towel with shaking hands. The cotton was absurdly thick, plush and warm. She pressed it against her bleeding cheek, hissing through her teeth as the fabric snagged on a raw edge of skin. She draped another over her freezing shoulders, trembling so violently, her teeth chattered in a steady, rhythmic cadence. She watched Roman from the corner of her eye. He looked like an accountant reviewing quarterly earnings, entirely unbothered by the violence he had committed just 10 minutes ago. "I traded a rabid dog for a quiet wolf," she thought again, the realization settling like lead in her stomach. Tommy hit her because he lost his temper. Roman Rossi killed because it was on his schedule. "He was going to kill me," Maeve whispered into the dark cabin, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She didn't even know why she was speaking. Shock, probably. Roman turned a page. Yes, he was. "Why did you stop him?" Roman finally paused. He closed the book, keeping one gloved finger holding his place. He turned his head, his pale grey eyes catching the dim light from the street lamps flashing past the tinted windows. "I didn't stop him to save you, Maeve," Roman said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. I stopped him because he was touching something I needed. Right now, that something includes you. Do not confuse utility with charity. It will get you killed." He went back to the ledger. Maeve pulled the black towel tighter around her neck, staring blindly out the window as the city lights blurred into a meaningless smear of neon. The SUV descended into the earth, spiraling down a concrete ramp that ended in front of a massive steel security gate. The driver flashed his headlights twice, and the gate rolled open with a heavy, industrial grind. They parked in a subterranean garage, bathed in harsh, fluorescent light, empty except for a row of identical black vehicles. Roman stepped out before the car had fully stopped. "Bring her up," he ordered the driver. Maeve fumbled with the door handle, her fingers stiff and uncooperative. The driver, a terrifyingly large man with a flattened nose and dead eyes, opened it from the outside. He didn't offer a hand. He just stared at her, waiting. She grabbed her duffel bag and limped out, leaving a damp, dark patch on the imported leather. She followed the driver to a private elevator. There were no buttons, just a biometric scanner that the driver pressed his thumb against. The doors slid shut, and the elevator shot upward with stomach-dropping speed. Maeve leaned her good shoulder against the mirrored wall, her eyes unfocused, trying to breathe shallowly to keep her ribs from expanding. The doors opened onto a space that looked less like an apartment and more like a high-altitude surgical suite. It was massive, stark, and violently minimalist. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city skyline, but inside, everything was matte black, brushed steel, and cold white stone. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter, just the humming silence of a perfectly climate-controlled void. Roman was standing by a massive marble kitchen island, pouring 3 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He had discarded his overcoat and suit jacket. His white dress shirt was pristine, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with dense muscle and the faint, faded edges of black ink. "Sit," he commanded, not looking at her, pointing a glass toward a steel and leather chair near the island. Maeve dropped her bag and shuffled toward the chair. She sank into it, the leather cool against her feverish skin. A door down the hall opened, and a man walked out. He wore slacks, a rumpled button-down, and carried a black leather medical bag. He looked to be in his 50s, with a receding hairline and a permanent expression of exhausted resignation. "Hayes," Roman said, taking a sip of his drink. "Fix her." The doctor, Hayes, walked over to Maeve. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't offer a comforting smile. He set his bag on the counter, snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves, and tilted her chin up under the harsh, recessed lighting. "Pupils are equal and reactive," Hayes muttered, more to Roman than to her. He prodded the swollen purple flesh of her cheekbone. Maeve jerked back, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth. "Contusion. Possible microfracture of the zygomatic arch. It's going to swell shut by morning." "Keep her functional," Roman said, leaning against the counter, watching the exam with the detached interest of an auditor. Hayes moved down, his gloved hands gently but firmly pressing against Maeve's ribcage. When he hit her left side, Maeve screamed, a raw, ugly sound that tore through the quiet room. Her vision whited out, and she slumped forward, dry heaving. Hayes caught her shoulder, steadying her. "2 cracked ribs, maybe 3. I need to tape them. Take off the shirt." Maeve froze, her breath rattling in her throat. She looked at Hayes, then her eyes darted to Roman, panic reigniting in her chest. Roman sighed. He set his glass down, the crystal clinking sharply against the marble. "Hayes is a doctor, Maeve. He has seen the human body before. I, however, have 0 interest in yours. Take off the shirt so he can work, or sit there and puncture a lung. The choice is yours." He turned his back to them, staring out the massive windows at the city below, offering her a meager, dismissive sliver of privacy. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the hem of her damp, ruined t-shirt. She pulled it over her head, shivering in the sterile, air-conditioned air, clad only in a grey sports bra and her wet jeans. Her torso was a canvas of ugly, mottled colours, yellowing bruises fading on her hips, fresh purple and black blooms exploding across her ribs. Hayes didn't react to the map of violence on her skin. He pulled a roll of thick medical tape and a pair of shears from his bag. "Breathe all the way out and hold it," Hayes instructed. Maeve obeyed, squeezing her eyes shut. The doctor wrapped the heavy tape tightly around her ribcage, the pressure agonizing at first, but slowly settling into a rigid, supportive brace that kept the broken bones from shifting. He cleaned the deep scratch on her cheek with an antiseptic wipe that burned like liquid fire, sealing the skin with a harsh, smelling chemical glue instead of stitches. "Take these," Hayes said, dropping 2 heavy white pills into her palm and handing her a paper cup of water. "Anti-inflammatories and a muscle relaxant. They'll knock you down." Maeve swallowed them dry before chasing them with the water. Hayes packed his bag, peeled off his gloves, and threw them in a trash can. "She needs sleep, Roman. And ice." "Noted," Roman replied, not turning around. The doctor walked out, the heavy front door clicking softly behind him. Maeve sat in the chair, her arms wrapped around her taped ribs, staring at Roman's broad back. The painkillers hadn't kicked in yet, but exhaustion was settling into her bones like wet cement. She was alive. She was in a fortress, but she was entirely, terrifyingly trapped. 20 minutes later, Maeve was sitting at the massive marble island, wearing a pair of black sweatpants and a dark grey hooded sweatshirt that smelled like detergent and faintly of Roman. They swallowed her frame, the sleeves rolled up 3 times so her hands could reach the table. Roman sat opposite her. The ledger was open between them. The glass of amber liquor was gone, replaced by a steaming mug of black coffee. "Thomas was a blunt instrument," Roman said, his voice flat, his long index finger tracing a line of smeared, erratic handwriting on the yellowed page. "He collected protection money from the docks. He intimidated small-time lenders. He did not possess the cognitive capacity to engineer a skimming operation of this magnitude." He looked up. His grey eyes pinned her to the chair. They were cold, intelligent, and completely devoid of pity. He was moving nearly $40,000 a week off the books, and he was filtering it through dummy corporations that trace back to a shell company in Panama. Roman leaned forward slightly. "Thomas couldn't spell Panama. So, explain to me what this book is." Maeve stared at the pages, the numbers blurred together for a second before snapping into sharp relief. She recognized the handwriting. Not Tommy's jagged scrawl. It was hers. Small, neat, meticulous columns of numbers. "He made me do it," she said, her voice raspy, the sound scraping painfully in her throat. "Do what?" "Keep track. Reconcile the cash." Maeve pulled the oversized sleeves over her hands, rubbing her thumbs against the soft cotton. "He brought the money home in duffel bags. He said if he was a penny short when he kicked it up to his capo, they'd take his fingers. But there was always extra. Extra he didn't report. And the shell companies? He didn't set them up," Maeve said, shaking her head. The movement made her neck throb. "He just made the deposits. I saw the routing numbers. I tracked them so he wouldn't lose his cut. Tommy didn't know how it worked. He just knew the guy he handed the cash to at the end of the month." Roman went perfectly still. The silence in the room thickened, becoming suddenly oppressive. "Who?" Roman asked, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper. "Did he hand the cash to?" Maeve hesitated. She knew the name. She had heard Tommy screaming it into burner phones in the middle of the night, but naming him meant crossing a line she couldn't uncross. It meant stepping fully into the crossfire of a mafia war. "If I tell you," Maeve said, her voice shaking, forcing herself to look Roman in the eye. "What happens to me?" Roman tilted his head, a microscopic tightening of his jaw, the only sign he was surprised by the pushback. "You are not in a position to negotiate, Maeve." "I am," she countered, her heart hammering against her taped ribs. The fear was making her reckless. Or maybe it was the fact that she had already accepted she might die tonight. "You don't know the cipher." "I wrote the cipher. The names in that book are coded. I used an offset algorithm based on prime numbers. It would take your people weeks to crack it. By then, whoever is stealing from you will realize Tommy is dead and the book is gone. They'll scatter." Roman stared at her. For the first time all night, the absolute, cold indifference in his expression cracked. It wasn't a smile, but a sharp, predatory calculation. He looked at her not as a weeping victim, but as an asset. "An offset algorithm," Roman repeated slowly, tasting the words. "You are an accountant." "I was a junior analyst," she corrected softly, looking down at the marble counter. "Before Tommy. Before I got stupid and thought I could fix him." "There is no fixing broken tools," Roman said flatly. "You throw them away." He closed the ledger and slid it toward her across the smooth marble. "Decode it," Roman commanded. "My price," Maeve said, her hands trembling as she pulled the book closer. She didn't open it. "I want a new identity. A real one. Passports, a social security number, and enough money to start over somewhere cold. Somewhere Tommy's friends will never look." Roman leaned back in his chair, studying her face. The bruised, swollen cheek, the split lip, the terrified, defiant eyes. "You want to disappear," he said. "I wanted that 3 hours ago," she replied. "I just emailed the wrong person." Roman didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth twitched, a millimeter of movement that completely altered the geometry of his face, making him look devastatingly sharp. "If the names in this book lead me to the rot in my organization," Roman said, his voice a quiet, binding vow, "I will not just give you an identity, Maeve. I will make sure the men who want to hurt you are entirely incapable of looking for anyone, ever again." He slid a heavy silver pen across the table. It rolled to a stop against the leather cover of the book. "Start writing." The silver pen felt impossibly heavy in Maeve's hand. It was a Mont Blanc, the metal cool and smooth against her clammy skin. She stared at the blank notepad Roman had placed beside the open ledger. The numbers in the first column blurred slightly as the muscle relaxants Hayes had given her began to melt the edges of her panic, replacing it with a thick, sluggish fog. She forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to be stupid now. She was sitting in the apex predator's den, bartering her life with elementary cryptography. 7. The offset was 7. She wrote the first letter. C. Roman didn't pace. He didn't loom over her shoulder. He sat perfectly still in the leather chair opposite the marble island, his forearms resting on his thighs, watching her hands. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, a pressurized vacuum that made the scratch of the nib against the paper sound like a knife on bone. "The first account," Maeve rasped, her voice catching on the dry air. She cleared her throat, wincing as the muscles strained against her bruised windpipe. "It's routed through a logistics firm in the Port District. The holding company is registered to—" She did the math in her head, converting the string of numbers into letters. Her hand shook. The name that materialized on the page made no sense to her, but the sudden, sharp drop in the room's temperature told her it meant everything to the man sitting across from her. Carmine Roman's posture didn't change, but his eyes went dead. The pale grey turned flat and opaque, like coins resting on a dead man's eyes. "Keep writing," he said softly. Maeve swallowed hard and moved to the next line. The process was tedious. Her ribs throbbed a steady, rhythmic warning every time she shifted her weight. The coffee Roman had poured for her sat untouched, a thin, oily film forming on its surface. She worked for an hour, the pages of the legal pad slowly filling with names, dates, and amounts. Carmine, Vitiello, the Santoro brothers. These weren't rival gangs. She knew enough from Tommy's drunken rants to recognize these names. These were Roman's own lieutenants, his captains, the men who drank his wine and kissed his cheek at syndicate weddings. She finished the final page of the current quarter and pushed the notepad across the cool marble. Roman picked it up. He didn't read it immediately. He looked at the list of names, his face a mask of terrifying composure. Betrayal on this scale wasn't a crack in the foundation. It was a demolition charge. Yet, the only physical reaction he offered was the slow, methodical flex of his jaw. "Thomas wasn't skimming," Roman murmured, his voice sounding like dry gravel. "He was collecting. He was the bag man for a coup." He set the paper down. He looked at Maeve. The adrenaline had completely bled out of her system, leaving her hollowed out, shivering in the oversized sweatshirt. The right side of her face was a swollen, purplish-black mass, her eye reduced to a swollen slit. She looked like a casualty of war. "You did the math," Roman stated. It wasn't a question. "You knew what these amounts meant. You knew Thomas was funneling millions, not thousands." "I knew it was a lot," Maeve whispered, leaning heavily against the counter, too exhausted to maintain her posture. "I didn't know who it was for, I swear. I just knew if I messed up the ledger, Tommy would break my fingers. So I made the code. I thought if I kept it complicated, he'd need me. He wouldn't kill me." It was a pathetic survival strategy. A mouse building a maze for a snake, hoping the snake would get tired before it got hungry. Roman stood up. The sudden movement made Maeve flinch violently, her arms flying up to protect her head, entirely out of pure, bruised instinct. Roman stopped. He looked at her raised arms, at her cowering posture. A flash of something cold and incomprehensibly dark crossed his features. He reached out, his movements deliberately slow and telegraphed, and took the silver pen from her trembling fingers. "Go to sleep, Maeve," he said, turning away. "What?" She blinked, her brain misfiring. The passport. I said I would give you a new identity," Roman interrupted smoothly, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the glittering, rain-slicked city. "And I will. But my passport forger does not work at 4 in the morning, and you are currently vibrating out of your chair." He didn't turn around. "There is a guest room down the hall, second door on the left. Lock it if it makes you feel better. I have a war to start." Maeve woke to the smell of ozone and the sterile, metallic tang of cold air conditioning. For 3 terrifying seconds, she didn't know where she was. Panic seized her throat, sharp and suffocating. She tried to sit up, and the world violently tilted. A blinding, white-hot lance of pain ripped through her left side, stealing her breath. She collapsed back against the mattress, gasping, her hand clutching the rigid medical tape binding her ribs. The penthouse. The wrong email. Tommy. Roman. The memories slammed into her like physical blows. She opened her eyes. The guest room was immaculate, devoid of personality, decorated in the same oppressive shades of grey and black as the rest of the apartment. Heavy blackout curtains blocked the sun, leaving the room in a state of artificial twilight. She carefully rolled onto her uninjured side and pushed herself up. Her body felt like it had been run through an industrial press. Her cheek throbbed with a dull, heavy heat, the skin pulled taut and shiny from the swelling. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She was still wearing Roman's oversized sweatshirt and the sweatpants. She walked to the door. It was unlocked. She hadn't locked it last night. She had been too exhausted to even turn the deadbolt. She pushed the door open and limped down the hallway. The main living area was flooded with harsh, late-morning light. The rain had stopped, leaving the city skyline sharp and clear against a pale grey sky. Roman was sitting at the dining table. He was no longer in the pristine white shirt from the night before. He wore a dark, charcoal turtleneck and a shoulder holster made of dark brown leather. A sleek, matte black handgun rested squarely against his ribs. He was speaking quietly in Italian into a secure satellite phone. He didn't look up as she entered, but he raised a hand, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen island. Maeve shuffled over. On the marble counter sat a white ceramic plate with 2 pieces of dry toast and a glass of water. Beside the water were 2 more of the heavy white pills Hayes had prescribed. She dry swallowed the pills and picked up a piece of toast. It tasted like ash, but her stomach cramped violently, reminding her she hadn't eaten in 24 hours. She ate it standing up, watching Roman. He hung up the phone. He looked entirely rested. There were no bags under his eyes, no sign of fatigue in his posture. He looked like a machine that had simply been powered off and back on again. "Carmine is dead," Roman said. He didn't offer a greeting. He just delivered the fact into the quiet room. Maeve stopped chewing. She swallowed hard, the dry bread scratching her throat. "His car suffered a catastrophic brake failure on the interstate an hour ago," Roman continued, pouring himself a glass of water from a glass pitcher. "The Santoro brothers are currently answering questions in a basement in the meatpacking district. They will not be leaving that basement." He looked at her, his pale grey eyes calculating. He was measuring her reaction. Maeve expected to feel sick. She expected the moral weight of what she had facilitated to crush her. She had translated a list of names, and men were dying because of it. But as she stood there, wearing a killer's clothes, drinking his water, all she felt was a profound, hollow sense of relief. Tommy was dead. Carmine was dead. The men who would have hunted her to the ends of the earth for that ledger were being systematically erased from existence. She hated herself for it, but she felt safe. "You don't look horrified," Roman observed, walking over to the island. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the physical distance she instinctively maintained. "I'm too tired to be horrified," Maeve said quietly. She looked down at her bruised knuckles. "Tommy used to hit me because I bought the wrong brand of beer. He broke my arm once because a guy at the gas station looked at me for too long." She looked up, meeting his terrifying, calm gaze. "You kill people because it's your business. It's clean. It has rules. Tommy was just chaos. I prefer the rules." Roman stared at her for a long time. The silence stretched, heavy but no longer oppressive. It was the silence of 2 very damaged creatures recognizing the jagged edges in one another. "Chaos is bad for business," Roman agreed softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. He tossed it onto the marble counter. It slid with a dry rasp and stopped an inch from her hand. "What's this?" "The rules," Roman said. Maeve reached out and pulled the envelope toward her. The paper was thick, slightly textured. She broke the metal clasp and opened the flap, tipping the contents onto the counter. A navy blue passport slid out. Beside it, a plastic driver's license, a birth certificate printed on heavy cardstock, and a sleek, black debit card. She picked up the passport. She opened it. The photo was her. It must have been pulled from a DMV database and digitally altered to remove the bruises and the exhaustion. But the name printed next to the photo wasn't Maeve. Clara Vance. "The debit card is linked to an offshore account," Roman said, his voice returning to that flat, unreadable baritone. "There is $250,000 in it. The funds are clean. The identity is backstopped. Clara Vance has a credit history, a dental record, and a liberal arts degree from a mid-tier university." Maeve stared at the passport. Her hands began to shake again, not from fear this time, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of reality. It was real. It was actually happening. The cage door was open. "Where?" she whispered. "There is a ticket inside the passport," Roman replied. She flipped to the back pages. A folded boarding pass fell out. JFK to Halifax, Nova Scotia. One way. "It's cold," Roman noted, a faint shadow of amusement in his tone. "And remote. The kind of place a woman goes when she doesn't want to be found. My driver will take you to an outfitter to buy adequate clothing, and then directly to the private terminal. You leave in 2 hours." Maeve looked from the boarding pass to Roman. He was already turning away, dismissing her. The transaction was complete. She had provided the intel. He had provided the extraction. They were ghosts to each other now. "Roman!" He stopped. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders stiffened slightly. Nobody in his world called him by his first name. "Why didn't you just take the book?" Maeve asked. The question had been burning in her chest since she woke up. "Last night, in my apartment. You could have let Tommy kill me, or you could have killed us both. You didn't need me to decode it. You have people for that." Roman turned slowly. The morning light caught the sharp angles of his face, casting half of it in deep shadow. He looked ancient in that moment. Not old, but timelessly, deeply weary. "Thomas was a dog," Roman said, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated in Maeve's chest. "I do not tolerate dogs that bite women. It offends my sense of order. It wasn't a confession of a hidden, noble heart. It was a statement of clinical, terrifying morality. He didn't save her because she was innocent. He saved her because Tommy broke the rules of his ecosystem." "And the code?" Maeve pressed. Roman looked down at the marble floor, then back up to her bruised face. "I could have had my people break it. But I wanted to see if the woman who accidentally emailed the head of the Rossi syndicate demanding a rush extraction had the nerve to negotiate for her life while bleeding on my floor." A tiny, bitter smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You are terribly clumsy, Clara. But you are resilient." He used her new name. The severing of the tie was absolute. "Go get dressed," Roman ordered softly. "The driver is waiting." Maeve nodded. She carefully gathered the documents, placing them back into the manila envelope. She held it tightly against her chest, right over her broken ribs, the pain a sharp reminder of exactly what she was leaving behind. She walked toward the hallway, stopping at the threshold. She didn't look back. "I'm glad I misspelled the email," Maeve said to the empty air. She heard the faint, metallic clink of Roman picking up his satellite phone again. The war was calling. "Have a safe flight, Clara," the apex predator replied. Maeve walked down the hall, clutching her new life, a ghost stepping out of the machine. The email was a mistake. But as the elevator doors closed, shielding her from the penthouse and the violent, perfectly ordered man inside it, she realized it was the only mistake she had ever made that truly mattered. Wow, the tension in that goodbye was unreal. If you loved this dark, gritty take on mafia romance, make sure to hit that like button. It really tells me you want more stories like this. What did you think of Roman's brutal code of honor? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to share this video with your bookish friends who love morally grey men, and subscribe with the bell on so you never miss an upload. Stay safe out there, and I'll catch you in the next dark romance deep dive.